In the small, rain-washed town of Blackwood, nestled in the hills of 1880s New England, St. Bridget's Orphanage stood as a beacon of order and tranquility, a grey stone building that the townspeople pointed to with a sense of pride and relief. They spoke of it in whispers of gratitude, praising the quiet that enveloped it, a silence they mistook for peace. To them, the orphanage was a testament to the goodness of its keeper, Miss Agatha, a woman whose name was spoken with reverence in the church pews and over kitchen tables. She was a figure of gentle grace, often seen in her simple grey dress, her hands always busy with mending or prayer, her smile a soft, reassuring curve that promised safety. The children under her care were described as well-behaved and devout, their voices never raised in anger or play, their movements orderly and subdued. The town believed that Miss Agatha had performed a miracle of discipline, turning lost, noisy souls into quiet, pious ones, and they thanked God for her presence among them. But this perception was a carefully constructed illusion, a veil drawn over a reality so dark that the townspeople's minds would reject it outright. The truth was that the silence they admired was not a symptom of peace, but of terror, a mute dread that had seeped into the very walls of the orphanage. Inside St. Bridget's, the air was cold and still, heavy with the scent of soap and damp stone, and the silence was not peaceful but oppressive, like a weight pressing down on the chest. The children moved through the corridors and dormitories with a hushed urgency, their footsteps making no sound on the bare wooden floors, their eyes downcast and wary. They spoke only when spoken to, and even then, their voices were faint whispers, as if they were afraid of being overheard. Their faces were pale and drawn, and their eyes held a knowledge far beyond their years, a constant watchful fear. They had learned that noise of any kind, a cough, a sob, even the rustle of a blanket, could attract attention, and attention from Miss Agatha was a thing to be feared. To the outside world she was a saint, but within these walls she was a quiet predator, her kindness a mask for a chilling purpose. The children saw the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, how her touch, though gentle, could make them flinch as if expecting a blow. They lived in a state of constant vigilance, their instincts telling them that the order she imposed was a trap, and the silence she demanded was a cage. Miss Agatha herself moved through this environment with an eerie serenity, her own silence more profound than that of the children. She believed with a conviction that was absolute and unshakable that she was saving these children from themselves. In her mind, their cries and struggles were the manifestations of imperfect souls, noisy distractions from the divine purity she sought to cultivate. Her methods were not born of rage, but of a twisted, ritualistic love, a desire to guide them to a state of grace through absolute stillness. She would watch them during their lessons or meals, her gaze lingering on those who showed any sign of disruption, making a mental note of who might need her special attention later. The children felt this gaze like a physical touch, a cold spot on the back of the neck that made them freeze in place. They knew that after lights out, when the orphanage was plunged into darkness, Miss Agatha would sometimes come for one of them, selecting a child who had been too loud, too messy, too alive. She would lead them away with a soft word and a gentle hand, and they would not return, or if they did, they would be changed, their eyes empty, their spirits broken into a permanent silence. The fragile illusion of peace was maintained until the day a new boy arrived. His name was Eli, and he was brought to the orphanage on a cloudy afternoon, his clothes ragged, his face smudged with dirt and tears. He was young, perhaps 7 years old, and still raw with the pain of his loss. That first night, as the other children lay rigid in their cots, pretending to sleep, Eli could not hold back his sobs. The sound was small and muffled, but in the utter quiet of the dormitory, it seemed as loud as a shout. The girl in the cot next to him, a thin child named Sarah with haunted eyes, reached out and gently touched his arm, shaking her head in a warning. But Eli, confused and scared, whispered a question through his tears, asking where the other children had gone, the ones he had heard crying earlier. Sarah's face went pale, and she put a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with a fear that was almost palpable. She did not answer, but the question hung in the air, a tiny crack in the foundation of silence that Miss Agatha had so carefully built. It was the first whisper of doubt, the first sign that the horror could not be contained forever, and in the darkness the children held their breath, waiting for what would come next. The night at Blackwood Orphanage was not a time for rest, but a vast, echoing emptiness, where every sound was magnified into a threat. The darkness here had a weight to it, a thick, velvet blackness that seemed to swallow the weak light from the single lantern left burning in the hallway. It was was in this darkness that a new boy named Samuel lay rigid on his thin cot, his small body trembling not from the cold but from a fear that had taken root deep in his bones. He had arrived only that afternoon, delivered by a stern-faced man who had spoken in hushed tones with Miss Agatha. The woman had smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that did not reach her eyes, and patted his head, calling him a strong boy who would learn the ways of order and discipline. But now, in the dead of night, the memory of that smile felt like a lie. The dormitory was too quiet, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the other children, but there were too few of them. The room was large enough for 30, but Samuel counted only a dozen shapes in the shadows, their stillness unnatural, as if they were afraid to even turn in their sleep. He had heard it earlier, after the lights were extinguished, a soft, muffled crying from a corner that had suddenly ceased, cut off as if by an unseen hand. The absence of that sound was more terrifying than the crying itself. Pushing back his rough wool blanket, Samuel slipped from his bed, his bare feet cold on the wooden floor. He moved toward the oldest girl in the room, a child named Eliza, who might have been 13 but whose face seemed ancient, her eyes holding a flat, weary knowledge. She was sitting up on her cot, watching him approach, as if she had been expecting him. He knelt beside her, the words tumbling out in a desperate whisper, asking her where the other children had gone, the ones who cried at night, the ones whose beds now sat empty and neat. He mentioned the boy he had seen that afternoon, a red-haired child who had been sniffling quietly in the corner, now vanished. For a long moment Eliza did not speak. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the door, listening for any sign of Miss Agatha's footsteps. Then she looked back at him, and in the dim light Samuel saw not fear, but a profound, resigned sadness. Slowly, deliberately, she raised a finger to her own lips, pressing it firmly against them in a universal gesture of silence. She did not shake her head wildly, but with a slow, grave finality, her eyes locking with his, conveying a warning that was more powerful than any scream. In that look he understood that questions were dangerous, that curiosity was a flaw, and that the emptiness in the dormitory was a result of a terrible, unspoken rule. The meaning of her gesture sank into Samuel like a stone dropped into still water. It was not just a warning to be quiet, it was an admission that she knew the answer, and that the answer was so horrifying it could not be spoken aloud. Her eyes told him that the children who cried too much, or asked too many questions, or failed to be perfectly obedient, did not get adopted by kind families in the city. They simply disappeared, erased from the world, as if they had never existed. Samuel felt a cold certainty wrap around his heart. This was not a place of safety, it was a place of judgment, where childhood itself was a sin that needed to be corrected. He crept back to his bed, the floorboards feeling like ice beneath his feet. As he lay down, pulling the thin blanket over his head, he tried to silence his own breathing, to make himself small and invisible. The silence of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of the missing, a chorus of absences that screamed louder than any noise. Eliza's silent warning was the first thread pulled from the tapestry of lies that covered Blackwood Orphanage, a single tug that would soon unravel into a nightmare of revelation, leading deeper into the darkness that Miss Agatha cultivated like a poisonous garden. Miss Agatha's smile never wavered in the light of day, a constant, gentle curve that promised comfort and order to anyone who saw her moving through the orphanage. She was the picture of devout care, her hands always busy with some act of kindness, mending a torn dress, soothing a fevered brow with a cool cloth, her voice a soft murmur that seemed to bless the very air around her. The townspeople saw a saint, and the children, in their silent terror, learned to mimic the gratitude expected of them, their small faces arranged into masks of quiet obedience whenever she was near. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, and the last of the daylight bled from the sky, when the orphanage was swallowed by the deep silence of night, the angelic facade melted away to reveal the true architect of the stillness. In the privacy of her sparse quarters, Miss Agatha would shed the skin of the caregiver, like a serpent shedding its old self, and her mind would turn to what she called her work. To her, the children were not innocent souls to be nurtured, but flawed creations, their cries and whimpers evidence of a spiritual impurity that needed to be scrubbed away. She believed that God desired perfect silence, a state of grace without the messy noise of earthly suffering, and she saw herself as his divine instrument, tasked with perfecting these imperfect beings through a final, permanent quietude. Her method was born of a cold, methodical logic that saw agony as a pathway to purity. In a small, locked drawer of her plain wooden desk, she kept her tools, a dark glass bottle filled with a clear, odorless liquid, and a soft white handkerchief. The liquid was a carefully carefully distilled paralytic agent, a recipe she had pieced together from ancient texts and forbidden knowledge, which she viewed not as a poison but as a sacred key. It did not kill. Instead, it unlocked a state of being she considered holy. It stilled the body completely, rendering the victim unable to move a muscle, yet it left the mind cruelly, vividly aware. In her twisted theology, this was the essential first step. The soul had to be conscious to appreciate its own purification, to experience the release from the noisy prison of the flesh. She would select her subject with a dispassionate eye, often choosing a child who had been particularly disruptive, whose sobs had echoed a little too loudly in the dormitory hall. The new boy, Eli, with his raw, grieving cries, had already drawn her attention, but she would bide her time, allowing the fear to settle in the others first. On this night, it was a girl named Clara, who had been caught whispering after lights out, whose turn had come. With the bottle and handkerchief in hand, Miss Agatha moved through the sleeping orphanage like a ghost, her footsteps making no sound on the worn floorboards. The air was thick with the fear of the children who pretended to sleep, their bodies rigid under thin blankets, hoping to escape her notice. She entered the girls' dormitory and stood over Clara's cot, her face illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, her expression one of serene benevolence. Clara, sensing her presence, opened her eyes and saw the same smile that comforted others during the day, but now it was a terrifying promise of something unimaginable. Miss Agatha whispered to her, her words a soft lie about a special prayer that would take all her pain away, that would make her pure and good. As Clara trembled, too frightened to scream, Miss Agatha soaked the corner of the handkerchief with the liquid and pressed it gently over the girl's nose and mouth. There was a moment of struggle, a faint kicking under the covers that quickly ceased, and then a profound stillness fell. Clara's eyes remained open, wide with a horror that had no outlet, her mind screaming in a voice that could not escape her frozen lips. Miss Agatha watched this transformation with a sense of deep satisfaction, seeing not terror but the first flickers of divinity. She believed she was giving Clara the greatest gift, the ability to see the world without being corrupted by it, to become a silent observer on the path to grace. The paralysis was not the end, but merely the beginning of her ritual, a preparation for what comes next. The heart of Blackwood Orphanage was not in its cheerful, sunlit classrooms or its neatly made dormitories, but deep beneath the foundation stones, in a place that existed outside of time and light. This was the stillness room, a hidden sub-basement accessed through a door so cleverly concealed within the pantry's brick wall that it was invisible unless you knew the exact pressure point to apply. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into a cold that was more than just a lack of heat. It was an active presence, a chill that seeped into the bones and stilled the blood. Miss Agatha called this place her sanctum, a sacred space where the final purification could occur. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and a faint, sweetish odor like forgotten herbs, and the only light came from a few strategically placed candles that flickered weakly, their flames never dancing, as if even the air here was too heavy for movement. The walls were bare stone, sweating a constant cold moisture, and the floor was packed dirt, because Miss Agatha believed that connection to the earth was essential for what she called the lulling. The children brought here were already chosen, their fate sealed by some perceived imperfection, a stubborn will, a tendency to dream, a spirit too bright to be contained. They did not come down the stairs on their own feet. They were carried, their small bodies limp and unresponsive. Before being brought to the stillness room, they were given a special tea, a bitter brew that induced a profound paralysis. It was not a violent poison. It worked slowly, stealing the ability to move first from the limbs, then the torso, until even the eyelids could no longer blink. The child would be fully conscious, trapped inside a body that had become a prison, aware of everything but powerless to react. Miss Agatha would oversee this preparation with a serene efficiency, her hands gentle as she administered the tea, speaking soft words about the peace that was coming, about the great quiet that would wash them clean. She truly believed that the chaos of human emotion was a stain upon the soul, and that only through absolute, enforced stillness could that soul be scoured white and pure again. Once in the stillness room, the child was laid upon a simple wooden pallet, positioned carefully on their back, arms at their sides. The paralysis was complete, rendering them as motionless as sculptures. The goal was perfect stillness, and Miss Agatha would sit for hours, watching for any tiny tremor, any sign of resistance in the flesh. The process of lulling had begun. For days, she would visit, sometimes multiple times a day, to observe, to ensure the silence was maintained. She brought no food, only small sips of water to prolong the awareness, because the starvation was not the point. It was merely the final, inevitable step. The point was the stillness itself. She believed that as the body weakened, the soul would begin to detach, and in that liminal space between life and death, it would be polished by the silence, freed from all its earthly attachments. She saw herself not as a murderer, but as a midwife to a higher state of being. The children's wide, terrified eyes, the only part of them that could still express emotion, were to her merely the last windows of a house being emptied, soon to be closed forever. The psychological intensity of the room was unbearable for any normal person, but for Miss Agatha, it was a source of deep satisfaction. She would note in her journal the gradual slowing of the child's breathing, the way the light in their eyes would dim from fear to confusion, and finally to a vacant acceptance. She recorded these changes with the precision of a scientist studying a fascinating experiment. There was no malice in her heart, only a cold, absolute conviction that this was a necessary kindness. In her mind, the world outside was a brutal, painful place, and she was gifting these children a gentle exit, a death that was not a struggle, but a gradual fading, like a note held until it disappears into silence. The supernatural element she attached to it was the belief that a soul cleansed in this manner would not travel to an ordinary afterlife, but would become a guardian spirit, a silent watcher over the orphanage, adding to the peace and order she was building. This ritualistic belief made the act sacred to her, a holy duty that justified any means. As the days passed, the child on the pallet would waste away, the hunger, pains a distant echo, compared to the profound agony of immobility. Death, when it came, was not dramatic. It was a simple cessation, a final sigh that was often missed unless one was watching closely. Miss Agatha would be there, always, to witness the moment. She would close the eyes, fold the hands, and then, with a sense of solemn accomplishment, she would arrange for the body to be taken to the orchard under cover of darkness. The lulling was complete. The soul, she was certain, was now pristine. This method, more than any other, represented her growing confidence. It was no longer a hasty act of discipline, hidden in a moment of anger. It was a deliberate, drawn-out ceremony, a theater of cruelty performed for an audience of one. The stillness room was her stage, and she was the director of a silent, awful play. Each successful lulling made her bolder, more convinced of her own righteousness, and it was this evolving grandiosity that would soon demand an even more dramatic expression, a method that would leave a permanent mark on the very earth itself. Miss Agatha's methods had always been a private communion, a series of solitary corrections performed in the hidden silence of the sub-basement. But as her conviction deepened, so did her need for a grander expression of her art. The individual lullings, while effective, began to feel insufficient. Like single notes played in an empty hall, she craved a chord, a harmony, a composition that would reflect the profound beauty of the order she was imposing. Thus was born the choir, a ritual that represented the peak of her twisted creativity. It required more preparation, more children, and a perfect alignment of conditions, but to Miss Agatha, it was worth every effort. She saw it not as an escalation of cruelty, but as an evolution of grace, a way to elevate the children's suffering into something transcendent, a silent hymn sung only for her. The playroom, usually a drab and cheerless space, would be transformed for these occasions. She would clean it meticulously, arranging a few simple, clean cushions on the floor in a semicircle, facing the empty fireplace. The windows would be shuttered, and the only light would come from a single large candle placed in the center of the room, its flame a steady, unwavering eye in the gloom. This was her concert hall, and the performers were the children who had failed to learn the lessons of quiet obedience. The selection process was careful and deliberate. She would choose 3 or 4 children who had shown a particular resistance to her rules, those with spirits she deemed too loud or too restless. They were given the paralytic tea, not in the secrecy of the stillness room, but in the dormitory, in full view of the others, as a final, terrifying lesson. The tea worked slowly, and the children would feel their limbs growing heavy, their voices fading to whispers and then to nothing, their bodies betraying them as they were led or carried to the prepared playroom. There, Miss Agatha would arrange them on the cushions with the care of a curator, placing precious artifacts. She would pose them, adjusting a head to tilt slightly, folding hands in laps, ensuring each face was visible in the candlelight. They were not tied down. The poison made that unnecessary. They were living statues, trapped in positions of mock serenity, their eyes wide with a terror so profound it had passed beyond panic into a helpless, frozen dread, were the only windows to the horror within. To Miss Agatha, These eyes were not filled with fear. They were gleaming with the first light of understanding, seeing the peace that awaited them. Once they were arranged to her satisfaction, she would take her seat on a plain wooden chair opposite them, and the performance would begin. There was no sound, no movement. The only thing that happened was the passing of time, measured by the slow drip of wax from the candle. Miss Agatha would sit in perfect stillness herself, her hands folded, her gaze moving from one child to the next, absorbing the scene. In her mind, this tableau was not one of suffering, but of purification. The unexpressed terror of the children, the silent screams trapped in their paralyzed throats, the internal struggle against the inevitable. She interpreted all of this as a beautiful, wordless psalm. She believed that in this state, on the threshold of death, their souls were being stretched and refined, their individual wills dissolving into a collective, harmonious silence. She called it a symphony of absence, the most beautiful music she had ever heard, because it was the sound of chaos being defeated. She would sit for hours, sometimes through the entire night, lost in what she perceived as a sacred meditation, feeling a swell of love and accomplishment that bordered on ecstasy. The children experienced it as an endless nightmare. Fully conscious, they could see each other, see the calm, approving face of their tormentor, feel the agonizing cramps in their unmoving muscles, the desperate need to scream, to run, to even blink away the tears that welled up but could not fall. Their minds raced with a panic that had no outlet, a silent frenzy that echoed in the shared space between them. The room, so carefully arranged, became an arena for a silent battle of wills that only Miss Agatha knew she was winning. She would sometimes speak to them in a soft, melodic voice, telling them how proud she was of their progress, how they were learning the ultimate lesson of stillness, how soon they would be free of all pain. Her words were a gentle murmur in the profound quiet, a cruel parody of comfort. The ritual would only end when the first signs of true physical failure began to show, the labored, shallow breathing, the distant look in the eyes, as consciousness started to fade. Then she would carefully have them return to the stillness room to complete the process, feeling that the choir had prepared their souls for a perfect transition. This new ritual, however, created a different kind of silence in the orphanage, one that was denser and more pervasive. The ordinary sounds of life, the scuff of a shoe, the rustle of bedding, seemed to be swallowed by it. The children who were not chosen for the choir moved through the days like ghosts, their communication reduced to furtive glances and the slightest of gestures, terrified of making any noise that might attract attention. This unnatural quiet began to seep beyond the walls of the orphanage. A traveling preacher seeking a donation found the silence in the entrance hall so oppressive he cut his visit short. A farmer delivering eggs mentioned to his wife that the place gave him the chills, that it was quieter than a graveyard at midnight. These comments were vague, uneasy whispers, but they were the first flickers of outside attention. The adults in the town, who revered Miss Agatha as a pillar of charity, dismissed these feelings as superstition or a misunderstanding of her strict methods. They attributed the silence to well-behaved children and a no-nonsense approach to upbringing, their admiration for her saintly reputation acting as a shield against the grim truth. But the attention was there, a faint, dismissive curiosity that, like a seed-cracking stone, would eventually find a way to grow. Leo was a boy of 15 who made deliveries for the town's general store, his life a simple rhythm of errands and small chores. But the one delivery that always made his skin prickle was the weekly trip to Blackwood Orphanage. The place stood on a hill overlooking the town, a large, stern building of dark brick that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Every Thursday, Leo would pedal his bicycle up the winding path, a basket of goods strapped to the back, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He would be met at the door by Miss Agatha, who always greeted him with the same serene smile, her hands folded neatly over her apron, her voice a soft, soothing melody that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a mask over something hollow. She would pay him promptly, her movements economical and precise, and she always had a kind word about the weather or his family. But her eyes, a pale, watery blue, never seemed to truly see him. They looked through him as if he were just another part of the scenery to be managed. Leo would hurry away each time, relieved to be back in the open air, telling himself he was being foolish, that the orphanage was just a quiet place for children who had no one else. On this particular Thursday, something was different. Miss Agatha seemed slightly distracted, her smile a little too fixed, and she instructed Leo to bring the delivery not just to the door but inside to the pantry, as her hands were full with mending. Leo had never been invited beyond the entrance hall. He stepped into the dim interior, the air thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and floor wax, and followed her down a long corridor. As he passed an open doorway, He glanced inside. It was a playroom, or what should have been a playroom. There were a few wooden toys on shelves and rag dolls sitting in a row, but the children themselves were the source of the wrongness. There were about 10 of them, sitting on the floor in a circle, but they were not moving. They were not fidgeting or whispering or playing. They were perfectly, unnaturally still. It was a stillness that felt heavy, like the calm before a storm, a silence so profound that Leo could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. They were like dolls propped up, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on nothing. For a heart-stopping moment, Leo thought they were not real, that they were mannequins. But then he saw the faint rise and fall of one small chest, the slow blink of another child's eyes. It was that blink that undid him. It was not a normal, sleepy blink. It was a frantic, terrified flicker of movement, a desperate signal from a prisoner behind a wall of glass. In that single blink, Leo saw a depth of horror that his young mind could scarcely comprehend. A plea, a warning, a silent scream trapped in a body that refused to obey. Leo stumbled back, almost dropping the basket, his heart hammering against his ribs. Miss Agatha turned, her expression mild, asking if he was all right. He stammered that he was fine, that he had just tripped, and he hurried to unload the goods in the pantry, his hands shaking. He could feel her gaze on his back, calm and assessing. He fled the building as soon as he could. The image of those motionless children burned into his mind. The sunshine outside felt like a lie. All the way back to town, he tried to rationalize what he had seen. Perhaps they were just very well behaved. Perhaps they were praying. But he knew, in a place deep down, that knew about fear, that no group of children could ever be that still. It was against nature. The blink was the proof, a crack in the perfect facade, a moment of raw, human terror that had leaked out before being forced back under control. That evening, over dinner, Leo tried to voice his unease to his parents. He described the strange stillness, the awful quiet, the look in that one child's eye. His father, a practical man who admired Miss Agatha's work with the unfortunate, chuckled and said that Leo had an overactive imagination. His mother agreed, saying that Miss Agatha was a saint on earth, that she ran a tight ship because those children needed discipline and structure. They told him he was tired from his deliveries and not to spread silly rumors. The town's doctor, whom Leo spoke to the next day when making a delivery to the clinic, gave him a similar response, patting him on the shoulder and saying that Miss Agatha's methods were unorthodox but effective, and that the children were probably just learning meditation or quiet time. Leo's vague unease was smothered by the blanket of adult certainty, by the powerful charm of Miss Agatha's saintly reputation. His observation was dismissed as the fanciful fear of a boy who didn't understand the harsh realities of caring for troubled children. He learned to keep his mouth shut, but the memory festered inside him, a seed of doubt planted in fertile soil, and so the secret remained kept, buried under layers of willful ignorance and misplaced trust. But secrets, especially those woven into the very earth, have a way of surfacing. The horror that Leo had witnessed was just one silent note in a symphony of suffering conducted by Miss Agatha. The unnatural stillness in that room was a symptom of a much deeper sickness, one that was slowly poisoning the ground upon which the orphanage stood. The children who disappeared were not adopted. They were returned to the soil in a way that Miss Agatha believed was holy. But the earth, a silent witness to so much, has its own limits. It absorbs blood and bone, but it eventually rebels against such a concentrated weight of evil. The orchard where the bodies lay, transformed by her chemical rituals, would soon begin to tell its own story. The trees would bear strange fruit, and the land itself would start to give up its ghosts, refusing any longer to be complicit in the quiet, orderly genocide that Miss Agatha called salvation. The boy who blinked had seen the truth, and though his voice was silenced for now, the ground was preparing to speak in a voice that no one could ignore. The storm had been a fury unleashed, a night-long tantrum of wind and water that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. It tore at the roofs of Blackwood, howled through the trees, and turned the streets into rushing streams. When it finally exhausted itself near dawn, it left behind a battered, dripping silence. The air was cold and clean, scented with wet earth and broken leaves. The orphanage orchard, usually a place of orderly rows and gentle shade, looked as if a giant had stomped through it. Branches littered the ground, and the soil was churned into mud. It was in this devastation that the earth reluctantly gave up its secret. The relentless rain had gouged a deep channel along the edge of the orchard, where the ground sloped down toward a stone wall, and there, where the roots of an ancient apple tree had been undercut and weakened, a section of the bank had collapsed, slumping away to reveal a pale, ghastly protrusion from the dark, wet soil. Old Elias, the groundskeeper, was the one who found it. He was a man of few words, who preferred the simple logic of plants and seasons to the complicated complicated noise of people. His first task that morning was to survey the damage. He moved slowly through the wreckage, his boots sinking into the mud, his heart heavy with the work ahead. It was then that his eye caught the unnatural whiteness against the dark earth. At first he thought it was a piece of porcelain or a large water-bleached stone unearthed by the storm, but as he drew closer, a cold knot tightened in his stomach. The shape was too familiar, too horribly organic. It was a cluster of small bones jutting from the raw wound in the earth. His breath hitched in his throat. He knelt, ignoring the damp seeping through his trousers, and used a stick to gently brush away the clumps of mud. With each movement, more of the skeleton was revealed. It was a child's skeleton, curled into a tight fetal position, as if trying to protect itself from a blow that had already fallen. The bones were small and delicate, but it was their texture that made the blood drain from Elias's face. They were not smooth and ivory-like, as he would have expected. Instead, they had a rough, granular quality, a grayish, stony appearance that made them look less like something that had once been alive and more like a grotesque sculpture carved from coarse, petrified wood. The small skull was tilted back, the jaw hanging open in a silent, eternal scream that seemed to echo louder than the storm ever had. Elias stumbled backward, falling onto the wet ground, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled away from the grave, his mind reeling. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was no natural burial. The shallow scrape in the earth, the contorted posture of the skeleton, and that awful stony texture. It all spoke of a violence that was beyond his understanding. He looked toward the orphanage, its windows dark and silent, and thought of Miss Agatha. The idea was so monstrous, so opposed to everything the town believed about her, that his mind tried to reject it. But the evidence was there, lying exposed in the mud. He forced himself to his feet and ran, not toward the orphanage, but into the town, his boots splashing through puddles, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He found Constable Harris just outside the town hall, drinking a morning coffee. Elias's words tumbled out in a frantic, incoherent rush about bones in the orchard, a child, something wrong with them. The constable, a practical man who disliked disruptions to his quiet routine, initially tried to calm the old man, suggesting it was an animal or an old forgotten grave. But the sheer, raw terror in Elias's eyes convinced him to take a look. The two men returned to the orchard, and Constable Harris saw the skeleton for himself. He stood for a long time, staring down at the small, stony form, his face a mask of grim disbelief. He crouched down, and against his better judgment, he reached out a hand. The bone felt unnaturally cold and heavy, like river stone. The rough texture grated against his fingertips. This was no animal, and no peaceful burial. The body had been hidden, and the condition of the bones suggested something he had no words for. His gaze was drawn irresistibly to the silent orphanage. Miss Agatha, the name echoed in his mind, accompanied by a wave of nausea. How could it be? She was a pillar of the community, a woman of God, yet the grave was on her property. He had no choice. With a deep sense of dread, he sent for the town doctor, a man named Evans, who was more accustomed to setting broken arms and delivering babies than examining unearthed skeletons. Dr. Evans arrived, his black bag in hand, his expression professionally curious. But that curiosity quickly turned to bafflement, and then to a profound unease as he examined the remains. He muttered about rare bone diseases, about calcification and mineral deposits from the soil, but his explanations sounded hollow, even to his own ears. He could not account for the posture of the body, for the shallow nature of the grave. The investigation was now unavoidable. Reluctantly, officially, Constable Harris began the process. He posted a man to guard the site and turned his steps toward St. Bridget's orphanage. The walk felt longer than ever before. Each step was heavy with the weight of what he might have to uncover. The town's peaceful illusion was shattered, the silence that had been so admired now feeling ominous and accusing. The key had been turned in the lock of the orchard's secret, and the door was beginning to creak open, revealing a darkness that the town had long chosen to ignore. The discovery was no longer just a mystery. It was the first thread in a tapestry of horror that was about to unravel. The ground beneath the Blackwood orphanage orchard had always been soft, a fact that Miss Agatha had explained away with tales of poor drainage and sandy soil. But now, under the relentless bite of shovels wielded by grim-faced men, it gave up its truth with a terrible ease. The initial discovery, the tiny skeleton that had sparked the investigation, was merely the first thread pulled from a vast, rotten tapestry. As the officials dug, their movements grew slower, more deliberate. Each thrust of the spade met with a mounting dread that thickened the air like fog. The sun, high in a cloudless sky, seemed to mock their efforts, casting sharp shadows that made every unearthed stone look like a bone. The policemen, their uniforms smudged with dirt, worked in a silence that was broken only by the crunch of earth and their own labored breathing. They were no longer just excavating a crime scene. They were unearthing a cemetery, a hidden geography of pain that spread out from the orphanage walls in a pattern that was both random and horrifyingly deliberate. With each new grave marked by a simple stake, the scale of the horror began to dawn on them, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, crushing weight that settled on their shoulders, making every movement feel heavy with significance. The first body they fully exposed was that of a child whose skeleton was frozen in a violent, unnatural contortion. The bones were twisted, as if in a final, agonized spasm. The spine arched backward in a cruel curve. The fingers clawed at the air. It was a posture that spoke of a death not from illness, but from some unbearable, sustained torment. One of the men, a young officer with a strong stomach, turned away and vomited quietly into the bushes, the sound harsh and out of place in the quiet orchard. The coroner, a weary man named Dr. Evans, knelt beside the open grave, his hands trembling as he brushed away the soil. He murmured that this was not the result of any natural disease. It was as if the muscles had seized and locked rigid long before death, a permanent rigor mortis induced by something unthinkable. This, he would later deduce, was the legacy of the paralytic T, a child who had been subjected to the lulling but whose body had fought the poison until the very end, leaving behind a fossilized snapshot of pure terror. A few feet away, another shovel hit something with a dull, hollow sound, not the soft thud of bone, but a sharper, more resonant crack. This grave yielded a horror of a different kind. The body within was not so much decomposed as transformed. The flesh was gone, but the skeleton had a strange stony quality to it. The bones fused together in a solid, rock-like mass. The earth around it was stained with a whitish, crystalline residue that crumbled under touch. Dr. Evans examined it with a profound, sickening fascination, noting that the chemical alteration was so complete that the child's remains had literally begun to petrify, turning into a grotesque sculpture. This was the result of Miss Agatha's later method, the poisoning that sought to create living statues, and the evidence of it lying in the soil was more chilling than any mere skeleton. It was a deliberate, calculated alteration of the very substance of a human being, a perversion of nature that spoke of a mind obsessed with permanence and order achieved through the most grotesque means. As the day wore on, the stakes multiplied, until the orchard looked like a patchwork of raw earth and grief. Each grave told a similar, yet uniquely awful story. One skeleton was so small and fragile, it seemed to belong to an infant, its bones showing no signs of violence but positioned with an eerie neatness, as if laid to rest by a caring hand, which made the context all the more monstrous. Another showed signs of prolonged starvation, the ribs protruding like a cage, a silent testament to the slow death of the stillness room. There were no coffins, no shrouds. The children had been buried in the clothes they died in, now rotted to scraps, leaving them exposed in their final poses. The officials worked on, their faces set in masks of grim determination, but inside, a cold fury was growing. This was not a series of tragic accidents, or even impulsive murders. The variety of the methods, the different states of the bodies, pointed to a long-term, systematic campaign. It was a laboratory of suffering, where techniques had been refined over time, and each small corpse was a data point in Miss Agatha's insane research. The sheer number of graves became undeniable, a count that far exceeded any reasonable explanation. The initial estimate of a dozen quickly swelled to 2 dozen, then 3. The men stopped speaking altogether, communicating only with gestures and grunts, their minds unable to process the enormity of the evil they were uncovering. The orchard, once a place of bitter beauty, was now a field of death, each tree standing as a silent sentinel over a child who had been erased from the world. The weight of the silence was immense, broken only by the sound of digging and the occasional, stifled gasp as a new horror was revealed. It was a silence that accused, that screamed of years of hidden atrocities conducted under the guise of charity. The officials felt the eyes of the town upon them, but more than that, they felt the invisible eyes of the lost children, their presence a palpable force in the air. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was physical, tangible, and it painted a picture of a cruelty so methodical it bordered on the ritualistic, a dark religion practiced in the name of order. As the last grave of the day was marked, The team stood back, surveying the scarred landscape. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows from the trees that seemed to reach like skeletal fingers across the ground. The digging was over for now, but the investigation was only beginning. The focus of every man there turned inevitably from the scattered bones in the earth to the solid, imposing structure of the orphanage itself, and to the woman who ruled it. And as if on cue, a figure appeared at an upstairs window, a calm silhouette against the lamplight within. Miss Agatha stood there, watching them, her expression unreadable from a distance, but her posture one of perfect, unnerving composure. She did not look like a woman who had just been caught in the act of genocide. She looked like a hostess observing guests who had overstayed their welcome, waiting with a patience that was more terrifying than any outburst of guilt or fear. The horror was no longer buried. It was standing in the light, and it was waiting for them. The constable and the two town officials found Miss Agatha in her quarters, seated in a plain wooden chair by the small window that looked out over the orchard, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if she had been waiting for them. The room was as sparse and orderly as ever, the narrow bed perfectly made, the Bible on her desk closed but placed with precision, and the air itself felt still and heavy, like the calm before a storm. She did not startle when they entered. Instead, she turned her head slowly, her face illuminated by the grey light of the overcast day, and offered them the same gentle smile that had comforted the town for years. But now, in the context of the grim discoveries in the orchard, that smile seemed to hold a different meaning, a secret knowledge that made the constable's skin crawl. He began to speak, his voice unsteady as he mentioned the shallow graves, the small skeletons with their strange, stony texture, the growing horror that they could no longer ignore. Miss Agatha listened patiently, her expression one of serene attention, and when he finished, she raised a hand not to protest or deny, but to silence him with a gesture of peaceful authority. She said that she had been expecting this visit, and that she wished to confess everything, for the truth, as she saw it, was not a crime, but a divine mission. Her voice was calm and measured, without a trace of guilt or fear, as if she were explaining a simple fact of nature, and this utter lack of remorse was more terrifying than any outburst of violence could have been. She began to describe her life's work with the careful detail of a scholar presenting a thesis, her eyes fixed on some distant point, as if she were seeing not the horrified faces of the men before her, but the faces of the children she had claimed to save. She explained that the children at St. Brigid's were imperfect souls, trapped in bodies that were noisy and flawed, their cries and struggles a distraction from the pure silence that God intended for all beings. Her purpose, she said, was to guide them toward that silence, to perfect them through a process of stillness that would free their souls from the corruption of the physical world. She spoke of the paralytic agent she used, which she called the key to the Garden of Peace, a substance that allowed the mind to remain awake and aware while the body was rendered motionless. This was not cruelty, she insisted, but mercy, for it gave the children a final opportunity to contemplate divinity without the interference of their own suffering. She described the stillness room in the sub-basement, where she would sit with them during the lulling process, watching as starvation slowly cleansed them of earthly needs. And she recounted the formation of her choir, where multiple children were arranged in silent tableaus that she saw as beautiful hymns to God. Throughout her confession, she used words like grace, purity, and peace, twisting their meanings into something monstrous, yet her conviction was so absolute that it felt like a force of nature, an unassailable truth in her own mind. The men listened in stunned silence, their minds struggling to reconcile the gentle woman before them with the horrific acts she described so lovingly. The constable felt a cold dread seeping into his bones as he realized that Miss Agatha was not insane in the way he understood insanity. There was no rage or confusion in her, only a chilling certainty that she had been doing God's work. She recalled the children by name, speaking of their transition with a sense of pride and accomplishment, as if she were a teacher discussing her best students. When one of the officials, a man named Mr. Davies, found his voice and asked her if she felt any sorrow for what she had done, she looked at him with something akin to pity, as if he were a child who could not grasp a simple lesson. She said that sorrow was an emotion of the imperfect world, and that she felt only joy for the souls she had helped to liberate. Her confession was not a breakdown, but a revelation, a window into a mind where good and evil had been rewired into a new, terrifying logic. The officials left her quarters in a daze, the weight of her words hanging over them like a shroud, and they knew that the coming trial would not be a simple case of murder, but a confrontation with a kind of evil that their laws were not designed to handle. Her trial became a spectacle that drew people from far and wide, filling the small courtroom until it was packed with spectators who had come to see the woman the newspapers were calling the Blackwood Angel. Miss Agatha sat in the defendant's chair with the same serene composure she had shown in her quarters, her hands folded, her gaze calm and unwavering. As the prosecutor laid out the evidence, the graves, the skeletons, the testimony of the officials, she listened with polite attention, and when it was her turn to speak, she repeated her confession without hesitation, elaborating on her beliefs with a clarity that left the courtroom in horrified silence. The trial exposed not just a killer, but a philosophical evil that challenged the very definitions of sanity and goodness, forcing everyone present to question how such darkness could hide behind a facade of charity and devotion. The demolition of Blackwood Orphanage was a solemn, joyless affair, a necessary surgery performed on the town's conscience. The wrecking ball swung with a heavy, rhythmic finality, each impact sending clouds of dust and splintered wood into the air, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the watching crowd. There were no cheers, only a collective exhale of grim necessity as the dark bricks tumbled and the sinister shape of the building was reduced to a pile of rubble. It was as if they were trying to erase a monstrous image from their minds by destroying its frame, but the memory was already etched too deep. Once the site was cleared, the earth where the foundation had stood was ploughed under and covered with fresh, clean sod. But the orchard, the sacred grove of Miss Agatha's madness, was left untouched. The bodies, so chemically altered and fused with the soil, could not be moved without desecrating them further. So it was decided that the entire area would be consecrated, the land itself declared a burial ground. The memorial that was erected was not a grand statue or a towering monument. It was a circle of smooth grey stones gathered from a riverbed far away, each stone identical and silent, placed in a wide ring where the orphanage's front door had once stood. There were no names carved into them, for many names were lost to the careful lies of the admission ledger. Instead, the stones stood as a simple, brutal accounting of absence. The townspeople would sometimes visit, placing a single wildflower on one of the stones, but they never lingered. The silence there was not peaceful. It was the same profound quiet that had once seeped from the building's walls, a silence that still seemed to listen. Children instinctively avoided the place, sensing a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the wind. The memorial was meant to be a place of remembrance, but it served more as a permanent accusation, a reminder of the evil that had festered in plain sight, witnessed but unacknowledged for so long. In the halls of government, the horror sparked a swift and severe response. New laws were drafted and passed with unanimous, grim determination, laws that mandated strict, unannounced oversight of all charitable institutions housing children. Inspectors were given new powers, record-keeping requirements became rigorous to the point of obsession, and a system of checks and balances was designed to ensure no single person could ever wield such absolute, unsupervised power again. These regulations were born from a searing collective guilt, an attempt to build a fortress of paperwork and procedure around the vulnerable to atone for the community's failure. The name Blackwood was never spoken in these legislative sessions, but it hung in the air, a ghost shaping every clause and amendment. The politicians believed they were building a barrier against future evil, but in their quieter moments they wondered if they were merely building a cage for the kind of monster they could understand, not one like Miss Agatha, whose evil was so complete it looked like piety. For the town, the aftermath was a slow, painful healing of a wound that would never fully close. The story was passed down, not as a history lesson, but as a dark, cautionary tale. Parents warned their children to be good, but the threat was no longer of a mythical bogeyman. It was of a smiling woman in a clean apron, of a silence that was too perfect, of a kindness that felt cold. The legacy of Blackwood was a shadow of suspicion that fell over every act of charity, a lingering question about the true nature of those who sought to care for the helpless. The new laws could regulate and inspect, but they could not legislate away the human capacity for deception, the terrifying truth that a monstrous mind could hide behind a facade of normalcy and even saintliness. The story closes not with an end, but with an echo. The smooth, silent stones of the memorial do not offer answers. They only mark the place where questions were buried alive. The stricter laws provide a measure of comfort, but they are a response to a past evil, not a guarantee against a future one. The unsettling truth that remains is that Miss Agatha's greatest crime was not the murder of children, but the murder of trust itself. She proved that darkness does not always announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it speaks in a whisper, in the soft, reasonable voice of someone who believes they are doing good. And so, the legacy of shadows endures, a quiet tremor of doubt that passes through every generation, a reminder that the most dangerous evils are not those that lurk in the dark, but those that learn to stand comfortably in the light, leaving behind a world forever uncertain of its own innocence. The horror of St. Brigid's did not end with the trial or the tearing down of the orphanage walls. The true lingering evil was not in the dramatic reveal or the shocking confession, but in the countless ordinary moments that had allowed it to flourish. The real monster was not the grand gesture of a raving lunatic, but the small, accepted silences that had built a fortress around Miss Agatha. It was the silence of the town, which had chosen to admire the quiet of the orphanage rather than question its cause. It was the silence of the delivery boy, whose unease was smoothed away by adult certainty. It was the silence of the authorities, who had been reluctant to investigate a pillar of the community. Evil of this kind does not need to shout. It prefers a whisper. It thrives in the gaps between words, in the averted gaze, in the comfortable explanation that allows good people to sleep at night. The terror of the mundane monster is that she does not stand out. She blends in, her smile a weapon that disarms suspicion before it can even form. Miss Agatha's greatest deception was not fooling the town into thinking she was good, but in convincing them that goodness itself had to be quiet, orderly, and obedient. She presented a version of virtue that was easy to admire from a distance, one that demanded nothing from the admirer but their gratitude. The children who suffered understood the truth long before the adults did, that true goodness is often messy, loud, and disruptive. It cries out when it sees injustice. It asks uncomfortable questions. The evil that festered at St. Brigid's was nurtured by a collective desire for peace, a desire so strong that it became more important than truth. The townspeople were not evil themselves, but they became accomplices by valuing their own comfort over the unsettling task of looking closer. They accepted the angelic image because the alternative, that a woman who prayed in their church and tended to their orphans was a methodical torturer, was too shattering to contemplate. The legacy of the orphanage is a warning about the architecture of evil. It is rarely a single dark castle on a hill. It is more often built brick by brick from the ordinary materials of everyday life, from trust that is never questioned, from authority that is never challenged, from sorrows that are too easily explained away. The real Black Room was not just the sub-basement where Miss Agatha conducted her rituals. It was the private space in her mind where she convinced herself that horror was holiness, and it was the public space of the town where people chose a peaceful lie over a painful truth. The echo of that quiet is what remains long after the screams have faded. It is the sound of a lesson that is too often forgotten, that evil does not always announce itself with a snarl. Sometimes it speaks in the gentle tone of a caregiver, and its most powerful weapon is the human capacity for denial. The story of Blackwood is a testament to the fact that the most devastating crimes are not always committed in the shadows, but in the broad daylight of accepted reality, hidden behind a smile and a good deed. The narration pulls back from the past, from the graveyard and the memories to the present day. The orchard is now a quiet park, and a simple memorial of smooth grey stones stands where the orphanage once loomed. People walk their dogs there on sunny afternoons, and children play, their laughter echoing where once there was only silence. The horror is buried, but the question remains, hanging in the air as faintly as a whisper. It is a question not about the past, but about the present. It asks us to look at the quiet places in our own world, the institutions we trust without question, the comforting stories we tell ourselves. It forces us to wonder about the smiles we accept too easily and the silences we are too willing to admire. The story of Miss Agatha is over, but the conditions that created her are timeless. The echo in the quiet is a challenge to listen more closely, to be disturbed by the wrong kind of silence, and to never let the desire for peace become more important than the need for truth. What do you think? In a world that still values order and appearance, could the quiet children of a modern Blackwood be suffering while everyone looks the other way? The true horror of Blackwood Orphanage was never contained within its walls, nor buried in the cold soil of the orchard. The real engine of its terror, the absolute and unassailable fortress of its evil, was a place no shovel could ever reach, the Black Room in the mind of Miss Agatha. It was a chamber sealed off from empathy, soundproofed against conscience, where a monstrous logic had been allowed to grow and flourish in perfect isolation. While the world saw a pious woman dedicated to order and discipline, inside that mental sanctum she was a god conducting silent symphonies of suffering. The physical basement, the stillness room, was merely a shadow cast by this deeper darkness, a workshop where the abstractions of her twisted philosophy were made gruesomely real. Her evil was not a hot, raging fire, but a cold, perpetual engine, powered by the certainty that she was right. This inner room was built not from rage or madness in the common, understanding, but from a serene, unshakable conviction. She had constructed a whole moral universe for herself, one where a child's tear was not a sign of sadness, but a flaw in emotional engineering, where a cry in the night was not a plea for comfort, but a discordant note that needed to be silenced for the greater harmony. Her rituals, the lulling, the choir, the petrification, were not acts of cruelty to her, but sacred rites of passage. She believed she was gifting these children a form of purity, saving them from the messy, painful chaos of life by guiding them into a perfect, permanent stillness. When she looked at their terrified, paralyzed faces, she did not see fear, she saw the dawning of understanding. When she recorded her observations in those neat, precise journals, she was not confessing to crimes, she was documenting a glorious transformation. The black room in her mind had its own windows, and they were stained glass, filtering the light of the world until it shone in patterns that justified everything. This is what made her so terrifyingly effective. There was no guilt to betray her, no flicker of doubt to cause a mistake. Her normalcy was not a mask, it was the outer expression of her inner order. The calm smile, the gentle voice, the impeccably clean apron. These were the authentic traits of someone who believed, to the very core of her being, that she was doing good. She moved through the world of polite society, not as a wolf in sheep's clothing, but as a shepherd who sincerely believed the flock needed to be culled for its own salvation. The community's admiration for her was the very thing that enabled her. Their unwillingness to see past her saintly reputation, their dismissal of a delivery boy's unease, their trust in the appearance of charity, these were the locks that sealed the door of her hidden chamber, allowing what was inside to grow unchallenged. The story of Blackwood, therefore, does not end with a demolished building or a consecrated garden. It ends with a quiet, unsettling challenge. The greatest danger may not be the monster who knows it is a monster, but the one who is convinced it is a saint. It is a story about the evil that polite society allows to flourish by preferring comfort over uncomfortable questions, by choosing a neat lie over a messy truth. The black room in Miss Agatha's mind was a singular atrocity, but the shadows that allowed it to exist are everywhere. They are in the willingness to turn a blind eye, in the rush to believe the best about those who fit our ideals, in the instinct to dismiss the whisper that something is wrong because it is easier than confronting the unthinkable. The orphanage is gone, but the capacity for such darkness remains, not in basements, but in the unexamined spaces between trust and vigilance. So we are left with a simple, haunting question, hanging in the silence after the story is told. What do you think? Could this happen again?